All right, welcome back to most to least prompting procedures. You should have reviewed this flowchart in preparation for class, but what I want you to do now, just to refresh your memory, is to stop the video. I want you first to read through the steps of the most to least prompting procedure in order, and then I want you to go back and read the steps with the considerations. So stop your video now and then come back and join me when you're finished. All right, now that you've had an opportunity to review those, my hope is that you were able to identify the components of an instructional trial within these prompting procedures. Because you'll notice that it starts with your attentional cue. Then the teacher would give the task direction, and immediately after providing that task direction, the teacher is going to provide the student with their controlling prompt. After the student is provided with the controlling prompt, which is the prompt that is least intrusive, that is most likely to result in a correct response, and the student performs the skill or the step in a chain task, you're then going to provide them with a consequence in the form of either reinforcement or error correction. And you want to make sure that you are collecting data as you are teaching the student, because I can tell you, having taught for many years, you will forget where a student performed or at what prompting level they performed if you aren't doing it in real time. I also want to remind you that it is perfectly okay to pair a verbal prompt with other types of prompts. When we're using the most to least prompting procedures, just as a reminder, this response prompting strategy is most often used with students who have the highest level of support needs, or when you are initially teaching a skill to a student. And oftentimes, our students and students with whom you're using most to least prompting have needs in the area of language, and so they require language instruction. And so, when you're pairing that verbal prompt with other types of prompts, so if you're pairing it with full physical prompt, for example, you are also teaching the student the language that is associated not only with the skill, but also with that prompt itself. So what we're going to do now is watch just a short segment of this video. I do believe that these are students who are implementing the most to least prompting procedures. However, they are not doing it as if it's a lesson. They're just showing the prompting and what that would look like. So we're going to assume that prior to beginning the video, they have already provided the student with the attentional cue, and they have given the task direction. So let's watch the video now and we'll discuss it as we go. So here they would have given the task direction, and now they are immediately providing the student with their controlling prompt, which is a full physical prompt. All right. So at this point, we're going to get to see the teacher start to fade that prompt. And the way that she would determine whether to fade, let's pretend again, because this is just a demonstration of the different prompting levels rather than a full instructional session, that at this point, the fading schedule is every 3 days. So let's say that the teacher has already done full physical prompting for 3 days, and based on the fading schedule that was determined prior to instruction, they are now on day 4, and they're going to move to the next less intrusive prompt. Okay, so let's see what that might look like. So partial physical. right. So we'll stop there. Now, we did talk about the fact that with an individualized prompting hierarchy, you're typically going to have 2 to 3 prompts in that prompting hierarchy. And so what I want us again, we're just pretending now, is that this is a student for whom these are the 2 prompts in their prompting hierarchy. And while I often encourage students to have 3 prompts within the hierarchy, there are students for whom 2 is appropriate. So if this was a student with a high level of support needs, we may have been providing them with full physical support across, time with multiple skills or skills that are similar to this. And our ultimate goal, while we want independence for every student, we know that that's not possible in the moment for every student. And so it may be that for this student, our goal is that they move to partial physical support. And for some students, if they cannot reach independence, we want at least partial participation. We don't want to do everything for our students. We want them to at least partially participate, although our ultimate goal for all students is independence. But sometimes it might take a while, right? They may not get that skill within a semester or within that year. All right. So I want you to stop really quickly and I want you just to do a quick write, like 1 minute. And again, you're just kind of thinking about this. How would you decide when to fade to a less intrusive prompt? When would you decide, or how would you decide when to fade? Go ahead and stop the video and respond now and then come back when you're done. All right, so when we are thinking about our fading schedule, and again, this is predetermined before you ever start instruction, there are a couple of ways we can determine when to fade that prompt to a less intrusive prompt. One of the ways that you can use is to use your professional judgment based on the data you collect. And again, we're always making data-based decisions. So it may be that you have set a criteria for this chain task for hand washing that we want the student to be able to perform it at a specific level with 100% accuracy across 3 consecutive sessions. So I want you to be able to correctly perform the steps in hand washing task analysis with full physical prompting for 3 consecutive sessions. So that would be using your professional judgment. You can also predetermine the number of sessions or trials that you're going to implement a specific prompt at before you fade it. So you may say that I'm going to spend 5 days at each prompting level before I move forward. And then finally, you can conduct probe sessions. And when you're conducting probe sessions, what you're really doing is assessing the student to see at what level of prompting is the student able to perform the task independently, or, excuse me, not independently. At what level of prompting is the student able to perform the task correctly? And basically, all that means is, are they ready for a less intrusive prompt? And how do we determine if they're ready? And so this is how you would conduct a probe. So we're going to go back to the student we talked about previously, and their prompting hierarchy was a partial physical prompt, and then a model, and then a verbal prompt. So let's assume that at this point, the student has, when you were employing or providing the partial physical prompt, that the student had 5 days in which they had correct responses. Well, when you're conducting a probe, you're then going to probe all of the other prompts in their prompting hierarchy as well as independence to see, can they, oh, there we go. They've got 5 days with correct responses, but are they able to correctly perform the task with a model? Are they able to correctly perform the task with a verbal prompt, or are they able to perform the task independently? And when you're conducting that probe, you are going to probe them at all of those levels. So if I give you a verbal prompt, and this is a probe is a little assessment, if I give you a model prompt, are you then able to perform that task correctly? If I give you a verbal prompt, are you able to? So you would basically assess them at all of those prompting levels, the levels within their prompting hierarchy, as well as independence. Because it may be that when you've provided them with that partial physical prompt, that they don't need the model now. They're able to move to a verbal prompt. And so that's what you're assessing. So, what does the most to least prompting actually look like when you're employing it? Well, first you're going to give, this is just an example, you'll give that attentional cue. So I might say, are you ready? and then I'll give my task direction, put your coat on. Once I give that task direction, I'm going to immediately provide partial assistance for all of the steps that are required for the student to put their coat on. Once they have reached either the number of sessions that were predetermined, once they have reached mastery criteria based on our what we have predetermined before we started teaching, or if you have conducted a probe, you would then move to a model prompt if needed. When you do that model prompt, you're going to go back through again. I'm going to give you the attentional cue. I'm going to give you the task direction, and then I am going to immediately provide you with that model prompt. Once they have either reached criterion or the number of days you're going to implement that prompt with the student, just as we discussed before, or if you've conducted a probe, you're then going to move to a gesture. And again, you're going to provide the attentional cue, the task direction, and then immediately provide them with the gestural prompt. And then, as always, we want to make sure that we are providing reinforcement. And in this one, it might be that once they get their coat on, I give them praise and I say, all right, now you get to go out to recess. And we know that recess is highly, highly reinforcing. All right, since we're not together and we're doing on a video, I'm going to talk you through this one, and then the next one I want you to do on your own, okay? So in this case, I would give the attentional cue, all eyes on me, and then get my task direction. What toy do you want? And then I would immediately provide the student initially with a model. Once we have gone through all the steps with the model and they've either met criteria or I have implemented a model prompt for the number of sessions that was predetermined, I would move to the verbal prompt, doing the same thing, then move to the gestural prompt because again, we're fading. We don't want to have students stuck basically at one prompting level. And so I would move to a gestural prompt, making sure that I am reinforcing students for correct responses. And in this case, I would provide the student with the toy that was requested. Now, again, if they make an error, you are going to always provide error correction, or if they don't respond, you are going to provide them with that response. All right, what I want you to do now is to stop the video, and you can just do this in bullet points. It doesn't have to be something that's long and that's written, that's written out in multiple paragraphs, but I want you to stop the video and I want you just to write through what would this look like if you were implementing it as a teacher. And then when you are finished, come back and we'll move forward. All right, I look forward to seeing what you all wrote as far as your prompting goes for the most to least prompting for this instruction. Now, I do want to make sure because a lot of times I have seen often that teachers get confused about the difference between most to least prompting and the system of least prompts. So I want us to be very clear on differentiating between these two response prompting strategies. So we're going to first start by talking about the order of prompts. When you're using the most to least prompting strategy, you're going to always start with the most intrusive prompt and then fade to less intrusive prompts as the student shows mastery or correct responses. That's different for the system of least prompts because with the system of least prompts, obviously we start with the least intrusive prompt and we only increase support if the student needs it. When we're looking at the prompt delivery, with the most to least prompt, you immediately prompt after the task direction. So I'm going to give you the task direction, then immediately give you your controlling prompt. And that is very different than the system of least prompts. Because if you'll recall, with the system of least prompts, students are always given an opportunity to respond independently before we provide them with a prompt. So most to least prompt, immediately provide the controlling prompt. System of least prompts, you give the student the opportunity to respond independently before prompting. When it comes to prompt fading, with the most to least prompt, we predetermine and systematically fade those prompts over time, either from across sessions or across trials. And that's different than the system of least prompts because with the system of least prompts, we adjust our prompting within trials based on how the student responds and what their prompting needs are. And then finally, what are the common uses? Again, with the most to least prompts, we typically use this with students who need really high support initially, whereas with the system of least prompts, it's used with students who can either respond independently, let's say within a task analysis, to some of the steps in the task analysis, or they could perform the task with minimal prompting. And so, in the words of a teacher, this is Caroline Fitchett, who was a special ed teacher, and she said, I use to teach students who were medically fragile and had very complex support needs. I found myself using graduated guidance, which we'll talk about later, and most to least prompting with this group of students because they needed a lot more full physical support because of their physical impairments. So again, most to least prompting is used with students who have that high level of support need, either initially because it's a new task, or because in this case it would be because of their level of complex support needs. So what I want you to do now, again, stop the video and just do a really quick write is what might be some of the advantages and disadvantages of using most to least prompting. So stop your video now and come back when you're done. All right, I look forward to seeing what you all came up with some advantages and disadvantages of most to least prompting. So here's some advantages that I can share with you. One is that, as always, we want to promote errorless learning, and most to least prompting is a response prompting strategy that is considered errorless or near errorless learning. It again is a really good choice when you're teaching complex or critical safety skills, because the last thing we want to do when we're teaching a safety skill is to wait on a student to respond independently. For example, we always use crossing the road. I don't want to wait on you to respond independently, and you might walk out in front of a car. So when you're teaching safety skills, it's a good strategy to choose. Another advantage is that students are successful immediately because you immediately provide them with their controlling prompt. They are immediately having success as a result of those correct responses. It has a structured fading procedure, which is very beneficial because you know when you're going to fade. And it's used with students who benefit from high support initially. And so when you have those students who do have the most complex support needs, you have something that you can rely on that will provide them with the success from the very beginning. So here's some examples of when you might use most to least prompting. I frequently used it when I was teaching students to zip their coats or their jackets. Because if you stop and think, when you are having to zip your coat and you have to, like, that little first thing where you put it in to get before you start to zip, that's a difficult skill. It's a difficult skill. It takes a great deal of concentration and fine motor skills. So putting on a coat and zipping it, or zipping a coat, is an example of when you might use most to least prompting. Writing is another time. If you think about the skills that are needed for writing, you might start off by providing a student, for example, if their controlling prompt is a model, you might give the task direction and then immediately provide a model of how you write a specific letter. Or something like tying shoes. Again, that's a very complex skill that's difficult for students to learn oftentimes, and so you may want to start with most to least prompting. Now, there are some disadvantages as well to most to least prompting, and one of those is that it can promote prompt dependence if you do not fade quickly enough. But remember, that's on you. A lot of times people say students are prompt dependent without saying they are prompt dependent because I did not fade the prompts quickly enough. So if a student becomes prompt dependent, I always say that's on you. We don't want that. We want students to increase their level of independence or move to the least intrusive prompt possible. It may take students longer to reach independence, and we had talked about that previously, and that is a disadvantage. It's less naturalistic. Students don't have the opportunity to perform the task independently or to try to perform it correctly. And it requires really careful monitoring for that prompt fading. Again, all of this goes back to you and ensuring that prior to beginning instruction that you have have established some type of prompting schedule or some type, prompt fading schedule, or that you have established a criteria and that once that student reaches that criteria, that you ensure that you are moving to a less intrusive prompt. And not only that, it could be frustrating for students who already have partial mastery of a skill. So, for example, if a student already had mastery of turning on the water and you're physically prompting them to turn on the water, that could be frustrating to a student. So just go ahead and stop. I want you to do a quick self-evaluation to see how you feel about what we've covered so far. All right, you got it. You're getting there. You just need a little more time, or I'm completely lost. Again, I encourage you to write those questions down because we will start our live in-person, not in-person, online session together with me asking if anyone has any questions. And as always, I highly encourage you to ask those questions and not to wait. If you don't understand or you need further explanation, I will be available after class, or you're more than welcome to schedule a meeting with me. All right, I'll see you in the next one.